At the very top of the world, there is a point that has no land beneath it. The North Pole sits in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, not on a continent, not on an island, not on any solid ground at all, but on a shifting raft of sea ice floating above 4,000 meters of freezing water. There is nothing there to mark it permanently. The ice moves. The pole is a mathematical abstraction, 90 degrees north latitude, the point around which the entire Earth rotates, made real only by the instruments of the people who have managed to reach it and the extraordinary cost that reaching it has historically required. For 100 years, from roughly the 1820s to the final confirmation in the early 20th century, the North Pole was the most coveted geographical prize on Earth. More men died trying to reach it than died in many wars. More expeditions failed, turned back, were crushed in the ice, ran out of food, or simply vanished without trace in the Arctic wastes than succeeded in making any meaningful progress toward it. The ships that went north came back smaller, their crews reduced by scurvy and frostbite and the specific grinding attrition of a place that is hostile to human life in every dimension simultaneously. And yet they kept going. Generation after generation of explorers, sailors, soldiers, and obsessives from Britain and America and Norway and Russia and a dozen other nations kept pointing their ships and their sledges north, kept pushing into the ice, kept dying in ways that should have discouraged every subsequent expedition and somehow never did. The North Pole was the last great geographical prize. And the human hunger for last great prizes, the specific combination of national prestige and personal glory and the philosophical need to prove that no part of the Earth was beyond human reach, was more powerful than any amount of historical evidence about what the Arctic did to the people who went there. The story of the North Pole is not one story. It is dozens of stories, of ships and sledges and dogs and starvation and scurvy and the specific psychological torture of months of Arctic darkness and the specific blinding beauty of the Arctic summer and the contested claims and the bitter disputes about who got there first and whether they got there at all. But the most important stories, the ones that define what the quest for the North Pole actually cost and actually meant, belong to a handful of men whose names the ice has kept. Franklin, Kane, Hall, Nansen, Peary, Cook, Amundsen. Each of them went north. Each of them paid a different price. Not all of them came back. The theoretical possibility of a northern sea route to Asia, the Northwest Passage around the northern coast of North America, or the Northeast Passage around the northern coast of Russia, had motivated Arctic exploration since the 16th century, when the commercial logic of finding a shorter route to the spice markets of Asia was strong enough to send ships into seas that no European had navigated and whose ice conditions no European understood. Martin Frobisher, Henry Hudson, William Baffin, the great names of early Arctic exploration, had pushed further north and further west than any previous navigator, accumulating the geographical knowledge of the Arctic archipelago at an enormous cost in ships and men and the specific suffering that the Arctic environment reliably inflicted on anyone who stayed too long. By the early 19th century, the geographical knowledge was sufficient to make the Northwest Passage a plausible goal rather than a theoretical possibility. The British Royal Navy, which after the Napoleonic Wars found itself with an enormous fleet, enormous crews, and no wars to fight, turned its organizational energy and its institutional prestige toward Arctic exploration with the specific efficiency of a military institution that has resources to deploy and needs something worthy to deploy them on. The Arctic became the Royal Navy's peacetime project, the frontier that justified the ships and the men and the organizational apparatus of the world's most powerful navy in an era of unprecedented peace. Sir John Franklin was the most senior and the most experienced of the British Arctic explorers when he was given command of the 1845 expedition that was intended to finally complete the Northwest Passage. He was 59 years old, too old, many argued, for the physical demands of Arctic exploration, and had already endured 2 previous Arctic expeditions whose hardship had become legendary, including the overland expedition of 1819 to 1822 in which his party had been reduced to eating their own boots and the lichen scraped from rocks before being rescued. The newspapers called him the man who ate his boots. He wore the epithet as a badge of honor. He sailed from the Thames in May 1845 with 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, both converted bomb vessels reinforced for ice navigation, and 129 men. The ships were the most technologically advanced Arctic vessels ever built, steam engines for maneuvering in ice, a heating system for the crew quarters, enough provisions for 3 years. He was cheered out of the harbour by crowds who expected him to return with the Northwest Passage completed and the last great prize of British Arctic exploration secured. He was never seen again. Not Franklin, not the 129 men, not the Erebus, not the Terror. The disappearance of the Franklin expedition became the most expensive and most extensive search and rescue operation in the history of 19th-century exploration. More than 40 expeditions over more than a decade spent searching the Arctic for any trace of Franklin and his men. The search expeditions mapped more of the Arctic in their searching than all previous Arctic exploration had mapped in its exploring. They found, eventually, what had happened, not to Franklin personally, whose body was never recovered, but to the expedition in broad outline. The ships had become trapped in the ice in Victoria Strait in September 1846. They had wintered in the ice, twice. Franklin had died in June 1847, the cause uncertain. In April 1848, nearly 3 years after leaving England, with 24 men already dead, the surviving 105 men abandoned the ships and attempted to walk south to safety across the Canadian Arctic. None of them made it. They died along the route, of scurvy, of starvation, of lead poisoning from the expedition's tinned food supply, whose solder leached into the contents, of the specific combination of physical collapse and psychological despair that the Arctic inflicts on people who have run out of options. The Inuit communities of the Canadian Arctic knew what had happened. They had encountered the Franklin survivors, starving, desperate, walking south, and had provided what help they could. Their testimony, collected by the searchers who eventually reached the area, told the story that the official British narrative was reluctant to fully accept, including the testimony that some of the survivors, in the final extremity, had resorted to cannibalism. The specific Victorian horror at this suggestion, the idea that Royal Navy officers might have eaten each other, generated decades of denial and counter-argument before the forensic evidence on the recovered bones made the conclusion unavoidable. The Erebus was found on the seafloor in 2014. The Terror was found in 2016. The ships that had been missing for 169 years were recovered by the specific combination of modern technology and Inuit oral tradition. The Inuit communities had maintained knowledge of approximately where the ships lay for over a century and a half, a fact that speaks powerfully about the specific value of indigenous geographical knowledge that the official history of Arctic exploration consistently undervalued. The Franklin disaster did not stop Arctic exploration. It accelerated it. The search expeditions had mapped the Arctic more thoroughly than any previous effort, and the commercial and strategic logic of the Northwest Passage had not diminished with Franklin's failure. What changed was the understanding of what Arctic survival required and the specific respect, grudging at first, eventually overwhelming, for the techniques that the indigenous Arctic peoples had developed over thousands of years of actually living in the environment that was killing the European explorers. The Inuit knew how to survive in the Arctic. They had been doing it for thousands of years. The specific technology of their survival, the igloo, the kayak, the dog sled, the caribou skin clothing, the knowledge of which animals to hunt in which seasons, the specific techniques for reading ice conditions and predicting weather, was a body of knowledge developed over millennia of genuine adaptive pressure in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The European explorers who adopted Inuit techniques survived. The European explorers who brought their own technology and their own methods and their own conviction that European civilization was superior to everything the Arctic had developed in response to the Arctic's actual conditions, these were the explorers who died. Elisha Kent Kane was an American naval surgeon who led 2 Arctic expeditions in the 1850s, partly in search of Franklin, partly in his own right as an explorer, and who pushed further north in the ice of the Kane Basin between Greenland and Ellesmere Island than any previous navigator. His account of the expeditions, Arctic Explorations, published in 1856, was one of the best-selling books of the decade in America, producing a public fascination with the Arctic that generated the specific popular pressure on American explorers to match and exceed British achievements in the high north. Charles Francis Hall was an American journalist and obsessive who spent 20 years pursuing the Arctic with the specific driven quality of someone who has found his life's purpose and is prepared to pay any personal price to pursue it. He learned Inuit language and techniques. He spent years living with Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic, acquiring the survival knowledge and the geographical information that the Inuit possessed and that the official expeditions consistently failed to obtain because they did not treat the Inuit as people with knowledge worth learning. He led 3 expeditions north, the last of which, the Polaris expedition of 1871 to 1872, reached the highest latitude any ship had yet achieved before being forced back by ice. Hall died on the Polaris under circumstances that have never been fully explained, possibly of natural causes, possibly poisoned by arsenic administered by someone on the expedition, his body preserved in the Arctic permafrost and exhumed a century later when forensic analysis confirmed elevated arsenic levels. Who poisoned him, if anyone did, was never established. The Norwegian contribution to Arctic exploration, and specifically the contributions of Fridtjof Nansen, brought the entire enterprise to a new level of sophistication that made the subsequent assault on the pole possible. Nansen was the most complete Arctic explorer of his era, scientist, athlete, diplomat, and the specific combination of intellectual brilliance and physical capability that the Arctic demanded in its most serious practitioners. His crossing of Greenland in 1888, the first ever, on skis, east to west across the ice cap, established him as the most accomplished polar traveler alive and produced the specific understanding of polar travel on skis with dogs that would define the subsequent generation of polar exploration. His Fram expedition of 1893 to 1896 was the most brilliantly conceived Arctic expedition in history, and one of the most brilliantly executed. Rather than fighting the Arctic ice, Nansen proposed to use it. The Arctic Ocean has a specific current system that he had deduced from the drift of wreckage, including wreckage from the doomed USS Jeannette expedition of 1879 to 1881, which had been crushed by ice north of Siberia and whose debris had appeared 3 years later off the coast of Greenland. If the wreckage had drifted from the Siberian side of the Arctic to Greenland in 3 years, then a ship deliberately locked in the ice on the Siberian side should drift across the Arctic Ocean toward Greenland on the same current, carrying its crew across the top of the world without the exhausting and fatal battle against the ice that previous expeditions had waged. He was right. The Fram, built specifically for the purpose, with a hull designed to rise rather than be crushed when ice pressure increased, was frozen into the Arctic pack ice north of Siberia in September 1893 and drifted, exactly as Nansen had predicted, across the Arctic Ocean toward Greenland over the following 3 years. It was the most comfortable and the most scientifically productive Arctic expedition in the history of the enterprise. The crew lived in heated cabins, played music, conducted scientific observations, and maintained their health and their sanity through the darkness of 3 Arctic winters with a thoroughness that no previous expedition had achieved. Nansen left the ship in March 1895, when it became clear that the drift would not pass close enough to the pole for him to reach it from the ship, and set out on foot with 1 companion, Hjalmar Johansen, and 28 dogs, heading north across the pack ice toward the pole. They reached 86 degrees 13.6 minutes north on April 7, 1895, the highest latitude any human being had ever reached, further north than anyone had ever stood, within approximately 400 kilometers of the pole, before the deteriorating ice conditions and the approaching exhaustion of their food supply forced them to turn back. The return journey, across the drifting Arctic ice, with no fixed destination because the Fram had moved since they had left it, was one of the most extraordinary feats of polar navigation in the entire history of Arctic exploration. They could not go back to the ship. They had to navigate south toward Franz Josef Land, a Norwegian archipelago they had never visited, using the sun and their instinct and the specific polar navigation techniques that Nansen had developed over years of Arctic study. They made it, wintering on Franz Josef Land in a stone hut they built themselves, surviving on polar bear meat, and being found by a British expedition the following summer in one of the more remarkable coincidences in the history of polar exploration. Nansen returned to Norway in August 1896, arriving at almost exactly the same moment as the Fram, which had completed its drift and emerged from the Arctic ice near Svalbard. The reception in Norway was the most overwhelming public celebration the country had experienced. Nansen was a national hero of the first magnitude. His furthest north record had broken the previous record by 4 degrees, an extraordinary advance. And his scientific results, the oceanographic measurements, the meteorological data, the specific mapping of the Arctic Ocean's depth and current systems, were the most significant scientific contribution to Arctic knowledge ever made. But he had not reached the pole. And the pole remained the prize. The race for the pole in the early 20th century produced the most famous and the most contested claim in the entire history of polar exploration, a dispute so deeply embedded in Arctic history that it has never been fully resolved, and whose resolution, if there ever is one, will require no less than the complete reassessment of the reputations of two of the most celebrated explorers in American history. Robert Edwin Peary was a civil engineer in the United States Navy who had spent 23 years in the Arctic, making 8 expeditions, losing 8 toes to frostbite, adopting Inuit techniques and Inuit travel methods with the specific thoroughness of someone who had learned from the failures of every expedition that refused to learn from the Inuit, and developing the Peary system of Arctic travel. Large teams breaking trail and caching supplies in advance, with a small final dash group, proceeding at the end, that he believed was the optimal method for reaching the pole. He claimed to have reached the North Pole on April 6, 1909, with his companion Matthew Henson, an African-American explorer whose role in all of Peary's Arctic expeditions was absolutely essential and who had been with Peary for 18 years, whose Inuit language skills and whose mastery of Arctic survival techniques made him the most practically competent member of every expedition he participated in, and 4 Inuit companions. The claim was announced to enormous public acclaim. Peary was celebrated as a hero. The National Geographic Society endorsed his claim. He received honors from universities and governments and geographical societies around the world. But there was a problem. Frederick Cook, an American doctor who had been on Peary's first Greenland expedition and who had subsequently conducted his own Arctic expeditions, had announced, 5 days before Peary's announcement, that he had reached the North Pole on April 21, 1908, more than a year before Peary. The Cook-Peary controversy became one of the most acrimonious scientific disputes of the early 20th century, generating congressional hearings, newspaper campaigns, competing claims and counterclaims, the specific ugly energy of 2 men who both wanted the same prize and both claimed to have achieved it. Cook's claim was eventually rejected by most geographical authorities. His supporting evidence was insufficient and his subsequent career involved serious questions about his character, including a conviction for mail fraud in the 1920s that permanently damaged his credibility. Peary's claim was accepted by most official bodies. But the doubts about Peary's claim have never entirely disappeared. The navigation records he submitted, the specific celestial observations that should have provided independent verification of his position, were inadequate. The speed he claimed for the final dash to the pole, covering the last distance in a time that would have required travel rates significantly beyond what any previous or subsequent Arctic traveler has achieved under similar conditions, has been questioned by every serious analysis of the claim. The specific absence of any independent verification. Peary had sent all his support teams back before the final dash, leaving only himself and Henson and the 4 Inuit companions, none of whom had the navigational training to independently verify the claimed position, made the claim unverifiable in principle. The most likely conclusion, reached by many modern historians, is that neither Cook nor Peary reached the geographic North Pole, that both their claims were either honest navigational errors inflated by wishful thinking and the specific difficulty of accurate position fixing in the Arctic, or deliberate fabrications amplified by the need for funding and the hunger for fame. The first person to reach the North Pole with independent verification was almost certainly Roald Amundsen, the same Norwegian who had beaten Scott to the South Pole, who flew over it in the airship Norge in May 1926 with Umberto Nobile and Lincoln Ellsworth. The first confirmed surface arrival at the pole was the Soviet icebreaker Arktika in 1977. The pole that cost so many lives and so many decades of suffering was reached, in the end, by an airship. The ice below it shifted and the point passed beneath and the Norge flew on. The Arctic had kept its secret well. And the men who had died in the ice trying to find the one point where the Earth's rotation is expressed as a single fixed location, the one place on Earth where every direction is south, had paid the full price of the most dangerous geographical obsession in the history of human exploration. The pole is still there. Still shifting on its raft of sea ice. Still 4,000 meters above the ocean floor. Still the point around which the entire Earth turns. And the ice that kept it from human reach for a century, The ice that crushed the Erebus and the Terror and killed Franklin's 105 men and stopped Nansen 400 kilometers short and sent Cook and Peary home with contested claims, is thinner now than it has ever been in recorded history. The Arctic is warming. The ice is retreating. The Northwest Passage that Franklin died trying to complete is now navigable in summer. The pole that cost so many lives to approach is now reachable by icebreaker as a tourist destination. The last great geographical prize turned out to be a mathematical point on melting ice above a frozen sea. And the price of knowing it was everything that the ice took from the people who went looking.